April 2nd brought a pretty big announcement on U.S. trade policy, a new reciprocal duty system for tariffs.
That's right. And the baseline sort of starting point is 10%, but it looks like many countries are actually facing much higher rates than that.
Yeah, exactly. So our plan for this deep dive is to, really get into how these tariffs are actually calculated, figure out which countries and which products are getting hit hardest.
And also explore the thinking behind it, right? The goals and the potential economic fallout, both here in the U.S. and, well, globally.
Absolutely. Let's start with the calculation itself. It's not just a flat rate, is it?
No, not at all. It's quite specific, actually. There's a formula they're using.
Okay.
Basically, you take the country's trade surplus with the U.S.,
okay,
divide that by the country's total exports worldwide, and then multiply that result by 0.5 or 1/2.
Right. So surplus with U.S. total exports 0.5. Let's try that with China. They were mentioned prominently. The numbers were what, a $295 billion surplus with the U.S.?
And $438 billion in total exports.
So 295 divided by 438 times 0.5. That gives you 34%.
Exactly, 34%, which is, considerably higher than that 10% baseline we mentioned.
Definitely. And China's a huge trading partner, so 34% there is. Well, it's going to have ripples. What about other countries? Are we seeing similar high rates elsewhere?
Oh, absolutely. The variation is pretty wide. Vietnam, for instance, is looking at 46%.
Wow, 46%.
And get this, Lesotho is actually hitting the maximum cap, which is set at 50%.
50% for Lesotho. That really shows the potential range here. Okay, so China's big, Vietnam's high.
Yeah.
Any other major players facing steep rates?
Well, the European Union comes in at 20%. That's significant, especially considering their auto industry and all the cars they export to the U.S.
Right, the auto sector. We'll probably come back to that. Any others?
Yeah, Cambodia is at 49% and Laos is at 48%. So you're seeing some very high numbers in Southeast Asia as well.
It seems like this isn't just targeting, the biggest economies. It's geographically quite spread out. What about the countries from the former Soviet Union? Are they included?
They are, yes. And there's a range there, too. It goes from 10% on the low end up to 31%.
Okay, examples.
Sure. Kazakhstan, for instance, is calculated at 27%. Ukraine is actually at the lower end, that 10% figure. So it really depends on their specific trade surplus and export numbers with the U.S.
It really highlights how that formula drives the individual rates. Now, you mentioned 25 countries have individually set rates. Does that mean separate from this formula?
My understanding is that for 25 specific countries, rates were determined and listed individually, perhaps overriding or supplementing the formula. It suggests a level of specific tailoring.
Interesting. Were there any, really noticeable countries not on this list?
Russia is a major one that's conspicuously absent from this new reciprocal duty system list.
Okay, Russia's out. And you also mentioned something specific about cars separate from this main system.
Yes, exactly. There are additional measures layered on top. Effective April 3rd, there's a new 25% tariff specifically on imported cars.
25% on cars.
And then, starting May 3rd, another 25% tariff kicks in, this time on foreign-made auto parts.
Wow, so the auto sector is really getting hit from multiple angles here. Now, what about our immediate neighbors, Canada and Mexico? Where do they stand on all this?
That's a key point. The existing tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Canada and Mexico, those are staying put. They weren't included or changed by this new announcement.
So the 2018 tariffs on steel and aluminum are still active, but they're not part of this new reciprocal duty thing.
Correct. They seem to be operating under a separate track, at least for now.
Okay, that clarifies the what and the how. Let's pivot to the why. What's the official reasoning behind this big shift?
Well, the primary justification being stated is the need to tackle the U.S. trade deficit. The figure cited is $918 billion for 2024.
$918 billion deficit.
So the argument is that these tariffs are necessary to make trade more, reciprocal, as the name implies, to balance things out.
Level the playing field, essentially.
Well, that's the idea. And tied into that is the goal of protecting and hopefully revitalizing American industries. Think steel, think automotive manufacturing.
Right. The argument being that other countries have had higher barriers while the U.S. has been more open. Is that it?
Exactly. That the U.S.'s lower tariffs have been sort of exploited, and these new duties are meant to correct that and encourage more production here.
And there was some strong language around this, too, about independence.
Yes, it's being framed as a move towards economic independence, kind of a declaration that the U.S. is pursuing its own trade policy for its own prosperity less reliant on others.
And legally, how is this being justified? I heard something about a national emergency.
That's correct. A national emergency was declared specifically concerning the trade deficit. That provides the legal underpinning for implementing such broad tariffs, citing national security and economic protection needs.
And they even called April 2nd a day of economic independence or liberation.
Yeah, very strong framing, definitely positioning it as a landmark policy shift.
Okay. Now, back to Canada and Mexico for a second. We know the old tariffs remain, but why were they excluded from this new system? Seems significant.
It is. There are likely a few reasons. Firstly, like we said, those steel and aluminum tariffs are already in place since 2018. Adding more might have been seen as overly disruptive.
Like a piling on.
Maybe. Secondly, there's the USMCA, the trade agreement replacing NAFTA. It's designed to facilitate trade within North America and generally frowns on new protectionist measures between the US, Canada, and Mexico.
So imposing these new tariffs could violate the spirit, maybe even the letter, of USMCA.
Potentially, yes, and it would certainly damage trust. Plus, you have to consider the sheer economic interdependence. Canada is the largest U.S. export market.
The largest. Wow.
And Mexico is our second largest trading partner overall. The supply chains, especially in auto and agriculture, are incredibly integrated. New tariffs would cause major headaches for U.S. companies, too.
Right. Disrupting those deeply linked supply chains could backfire significantly and politically.
Politically, maintaining stability within the USMCA framework and avoiding immediate, strong retaliation from your neighbors is likely a high priority. So excluding them makes sense from that angle, too.
Okay, that covers Canada and Mexico. What about other countries not on the list? You mentioned Russia wasn't there. Anyone else?
Yes, several others weren't included. You've got Russia, North Korea, Cuba, Belarus. For those, it's likely because existing very broad economic sanctions already heavily restrict trade. Adding tariffs would be, somewhat redundant.
Makes sense. Existing sanctions are already doing the heavy lifting there. Who else was excluded?
The list also includes places like the UK, Singapore, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, Turkey, Colombia, Argentina, El Salvador, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. Quite a few, actually.
And the reasons for those exclusions?
Probably varies. For some, it might just be that the trade volume with the U.S. isn't that large. For others, perhaps they don't currently have significant barriers to U.S. goods, so the reciprocity argument doesn't apply as strongly. It's likely a mix of factors.
So a combination of existing sanctions, trade deals, trade volume, maybe strategic relationships. It's complex. Okay, let's talk consequences. What are the experts predicting for the U.S. economy from all this?
Well, in the short term, the general expectation is a bit of a slowdown in GDP growth.
Slower growth.
And an uptick in inflation. Projections are maybe a 1% to 2% increase by the end of 2025.
Higher inflation, okay. And for businesses?
Increased costs, especially for those relying on imports. Think about companies needing to potentially shift production, find new suppliers. That all costs money and takes time.
So slower growth, higher prices, and business disruption. Is the administration planning anything to, soften that blow?
They have mentioned planning a tax cut, specifically a 100 basis point reduction potentially coming in the summer, intended to offset some of these negative impacts.
A tax cut as a countermeasure. Interesting. How's the rest of the world taking this news?
Predictably, not well. Reports indicate both China and the EU are already preparing retaliatory tariffs.
Retaliation. That sounds like the start of a trade war.
That's certainly the big fear. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, is launching emergency consultations, and we're hearing Asian manufacturers are already exploring moving production to countries not hit by these high tariffs to maintain access to the U.S. market.
So potential shifts in global manufacturing, too. How does this compare historically? Is this unprecedented?
It's being called the most significant shift in U.S. trade policy since those initial tariffs targeting China back in 2018. And economists are definitely warning about the risk of a global trade war, potentially shaving, 0.5 to 0.7% off global GDP by 2026 if things escalate.
A noticeable hit to the global economy. Okay, let's bring it really close to home. Food prices. Which parts of the U.S. might feel the pinch the most if food imports get more expensive?
Certain areas are definitely more vulnerable. Hawaii stands out. They already have a high cost of living and import a huge amount of their food. Tariffs will likely hit them hard.
Yeah. Bean Islands, that makes sense. Where else?
The Southeast and many rural areas could also feel it acutely. Incomes tend to be lower, so even small price hikes on essentials are felt more. Plus, some rural places have fewer grocery options, less competition to keep prices down.
So, lower incomes and less access to alternatives. What about places like California? High cost of living there, too.
Right. California and other coastal states often have high living costs and rely heavily on imported food items, so they could face a double whammy, similar in some ways to Hawaii.
And any other areas, maybe based on climate or geography?
Yeah, places with limited access to fresh food specifically, think Alaska, obviously, due to remoteness, but also some urban food deserts where grocery stores are scarce, could see affordability challenges worsen.
It really shows how a national policy can have very uneven impacts depending on local circumstances.
Okay, digging into the grocery basket itself, what specific foods are likely to get more expensive?
Expect to see it in fresh produce first. Things like imported berries, strawberries, cherries, leafy greens, maybe asparagus when it's out of season here. Those often come from abroad.
Okay, fruit and veg. What about meat?
Beef could definitely see a price bump. We import a fair amount of beef, so the cost of, say, ground beef for burgers might go up.
Not good news for summer barbecues. Any other staples?
Things like sugar and coffee, where we import the raw commodity, could get pricier. And imported dairy, especially cheeses from Europe, likely gets more expensive too.
Okay. Any specific popular items like everyone loves avocados?
Avocados, yeah.
Yeah.
We import a lot of those. They're definitely on the list of things likely to cost more. Also, organic and natural foods, which often have premium pricing anyway, could see further increases if they rely on imported ingredients. So it really could touch many parts of the average grocery shop. Looking beyond food, what are the broader consequences for Americans? Economically, socially?
Economically, besides the general inflation we talked about, maybe 1 to 2.7% overall price increase, some models suggest a potential drop in real GDP per capita by around 0.9%.
That translates to real money for households, right?
Yeah. One analysis estimated the average household could lose somewhere between $1,600 and $2,000 per year in purchasing power due to higher prices.
Ouch. And jobs. You mentioned potential negative impacts earlier.
Right. Some forecasts, like one from Moody's, are quite pessimistic, suggesting potentially millions of job losses, maybe up to 5.5 million, and unemployment rising towards 7% if things play out badly.
That's a serious potential social cost. Anything else? Housing?
Possibly. If tariffs hit imported building materials like lumber, that could add significantly to the cost of building a new home. One estimate was around $21,000 added to an average new house price.
Wow. Okay, so impacts on prices, jobs, even housing costs. What about businesses themselves? How are they reacting?
There's definitely increased uncertainty. We're seeing signs of potentially reduced manufacturing output as companies worry about component costs. Business confidence seems to be taking a hit, too, as everyone tries to figure out what this means long-term.
Understandable. And globally, just to recap the main fear.
The big worry is a tit-for-tat trade war. The U.S. imposes tariffs, other countries retaliate against U.S. goods, and it spirals, hurting global growth and pushing up inflation everywhere.
A negative feedback loop, basically. Okay, let's quickly list some other specific goods, non-food items likely to see price hikes. Electronics.
Definitely. Computers, smartphones, game consoles, VR headsets. So many components come from overseas. Tariffs on those parts will likely mean higher prices for the finished goods.
Cars and car parts.
Yes, imported cars, especially from Japan and Germany, are expected to get pricier with that 25% tariff. And the separate 25% on foreign auto parts means repairs could cost more too.
Clothing. Furniture.
Apparel and shoes, yes, particularly those imported from places like China and Vietnam. Same for imported furniture and major appliances, refrigerators, washing machines, things like that. Building materials we mentioned too.
So a pretty wide range of consumer goods potentially affected. Finally, thinking about the food price hike specifically, how might this actually change what Americans eat or how they shop?
You could see shifts to cheaper options. Maybe more chicken instead of beef if beef prices climb. Perhaps more reliance on frozen or canned fruits and vegetables instead of fresh, especially imported ones.
So trading down or swapping items based on price?
Exactly. We might also see reduced consumption of some things altogether if they get too expensive, maybe like imported cheeses or certain types of produce, particularly for lower income families.
What about eating habits, like eating out versus cooking?
That could change too. More cooking at home seems likely if restaurant prices also reflect higher ingredient costs. Or when people do eat out, maybe choosing cheaper menu options. Even simple things like packing a lunch or eating breakfast at home more often could become more common.
And shopping behavior, more bargain hunting.
Absolutely. Expect to see more focus on coupons, sales flyers, loyalty programs. People will likely become much more price sensitive and actively look for ways to make their grocery dollars stretch further.
It really underscores how these high-level trade policies can trickle down and influence everyday choices and behaviors. These tariffs are clearly a major development, with ripples likely to be felt across the U.S. and the world for some time.
Definitely. The global economy is so interconnected, changes like these rarely happen in isolation. It will be crucial to watch how this unfolds.
Indeed. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.